In this video, I am going to present how to integrate a MuleSoft RPA automation and an Anypoint API. Salesforce acquired MuleSoft RPA to enable complete end-to-end business automation. RPA was a missing piece to accomplish this, and it is now part of the Salesforce Hyperautomation Suite, which means the automations can be published and reused across the platform. With API automations, we can accomplish most of the organization's automation needs. However, in certain scenarios, they just don't work. Sometimes we need a UI automation, which is basically a bot simulating human interactions. This diagram illustrates what I am going to be presenting today. From a system API, we are going to start an automation process in a MuleSoft RPA bot, which is going to unlock data from a legacy system and send the results back to the system API. This is the MuleSoft RPA Builder, and here we have an automation that we want to integrate with an Anypoint API. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at some of the activity parameters I had to create for this automation. This can be input or output parameters. For example, the product code. This is an input parameter, which the system API can use to send a code asking the bot to search for this particular product. On the other hand, best price and best store are output parameters, meaning the bot will process this information and use this to send the results back to the API. So here we have many other activity parameters that will be used during the integration between the automated process and the system API. So here we have the same automation, RPA demo v1, but this time we are looking at our RPA manager, and it is in the production phase of the RPA lifecycle. If we want to be able to invoke this automation from an API, we need to create an invocable run configuration. So let's go ahead and do this. First, we need to create a name and a description for this configuration. Then we set our activity parameters we've seen before. These are just the default values, which can be overwritten. So I'll just leave the default values and go to the next step. Some automations can combine automated tasks with user tasks. In our case, we don't have any user tasks, so we can go to the next step, which is setting how this automation will be executed in a secure session or in an existing console or RDP session. This is recommended for running the automation locally. So I will choose this one and go to the next step, which is selecting the bot, which will actually execute the automation. I will select the first one, which is available, and it's actually a bot that's running on my own environment, on my local environment. And that's pretty much it. I will just save and publish this. So now that's published, this means that the automation will be available in Anypoint Exchange. So here we are in our Anypoint Exchange, and as you can see, there is this REST API called RPA demo v1. What this is what we call an automation API, which was generated when we created the invocable run configuration. So this is basically an API that exposes the automation by wrapping it with a few endpoints. So we have the executions endpoint under V1 and also under V2. The difference is that the V2 takes client ID and client secret and the V1 doesn't. So if we expand this executions endpoint, we have these two resources, start process and start process non-idempotent. The difference is that this one will immediately return an execution ID, which is a unique ID with which you can use this other resource, get process execution status under this execution ID. And with this, we can check for the status for a particular execution. So it can be in progress, error, or success. If it's a success, then we will be able to see all of the activity parameters, including the output parameters that were processed by the bot. So let's go ahead and try to run this endpoint start process non-idempotent. So if we click here, we can see the documentation that was generated. This is a post method. So here we have the request body, we have the response for a successful run and so on. Here on the right side, if we choose the RPA server, we can actually start the automation from here. If we scroll down a bit, here we have the request body, so we can edit the request body here. Say, for example, I want to search for product code 1002, and we can send this request from here, but I will need an API key to run this. So I will show you now how we can get this API key in RPA Manager. So we are back in RPA Manager. Here in the main menu, under bot management, we have this API key option. And here's where we can create a new API key. I already have one, so I don't need to create another, but this is where I would create if I had to. And now we can use this API key to run the request. So back in Anypoint Exchange, with the API key, we just need to select this option, which will allow us to paste this X API key in here. And then we can send, and we are almost ready to run this automation. But before we run it, I just want to talk a little bit about the callback URI. So now we know how the system API can use the start process or start process non-idempotent endpoints to send some parameters and start the automation in the bot. So this will trigger the bot, which will interact with the legacy system in our example, and it will process the data and get the results we want. And now the question is, how do we send these results back to the API? So this can be done by doing a callback request. So this will be done asynchronously from the system API perspective. And the callback can be done in two different ways. So the first option we have to set up the callback is to use this built-in property, callback URI. And if we specify a URL here, in this case, we have localhost and we have this callback endpoint, which is an endpoint in our system API that will be handling the callback. If we specify this property, as you can see here in the documentation, the respective endpoint will be invoked after the process execution has finished. So this will be done automatically. We don't need to add this step in our automation. MuleSoft RPA will do this for us, so this is the easiest way to do the callback. Now, if we want to have more control over this callback, we could add it ourselves in the automation. So we can create some activity parameters. For example, here I have API base path and API path. So here I will configure the URL, and then in the automation, in the last step, just before completing this process, we can create a custom callback by using the REST call function, which can be found here under the Network tab in the toolbox. We just need to drag and drop this into the activity workflow. And one of the benefits of doing this programmatically is that we can create this inside a managed flow, which will give us an error handling mechanism. Another benefit is that by using this REST call function, we will have more flexibility. We can use the activity parameters, so the input parameters, to build the URL, for example. We can also create the request body payload with only the data that we actually need to send to the API, rather than sending all of the activity parameters, which will happen if you use the built-in callback URI. This will also give us more control. For example, we will have access to header parameters, query parameters, and different authentication types. Let's take a look now in my Anypoint Studio at this system API I've created just for testing purposes, which has these two very basic flows. The first one is the getProduct flow, which will take a product code from the query parameters, and we will build a payload mostly hard-coded just for simplicity. So here we have the product code, we have the username Studio01, we have the user password, we have the API base path, the API path, and so on. So we will try to use this payload to start the automation. To do this, we will need to import the automation API connector from Anypoint Exchange. So I will click here in Search in Exchange, and I will search for RPA. So RPA demo v1, this is our automation. So I will add this module. Here, and as you can see, we have all of the connectors available here for RPA demo v1. So here we will try to use this one, the start process non-idempotent v1. So I will drag it here. It will take this payload, and we need obviously to create configuration for it. I've already done it, so I will just show you what I have here. This is the configuration for the connector. So we can check the host name in Anypoint Exchange and just copy it here. The port will be 443. The base path will be /RPA/API. The protocol should be HTTPS. And the API key, we already know how to get this. Now let me just test this connection. So everything looks good, so we are ready to use this connector. This connector will start the automation, and it will immediately get an execution ID, which we will just log here, and the output of this flow will be just the execution ID. The automation will be running asynchronously, and because the bot we selected in the run configuration is deployed in my local environment, at this point we should see the bot taking over my screen it will open a legacy system using these credentials we are sending here, we hard-coded here, and it will look for best price and best store for this product code we are sending as an input parameter. And in the last step of the automation, it will send a callback to this system API. And here we have a flow that will handle the callback. So for this example, we will just log the payload that's coming from the bot. But in a real world scenario, we would do something like dropping a message into a message broker queue, and then we could have a process API listening to that queue. So in the console, we should be able to see something like this. So this is the request we are sending from the automation in the last step with the product code, best price, best store, and product name. So let's go ahead and test this. We will send a request to this get products flow, sending a product code. And let's see if the automation works, and let's see if the integration between our system API and our automation works. Okay, we are ready to test this. We'll send a GET request to the system API, which is running in my local host, in the product endpoint with product code 1001. So let's hit the send button and see what happens. So we already got the response here, which is just the execution ID. The automation is about to start in my local environment. So I will just take my hands off and wait for the bot to take over. So the bot is controlling my screen now. It is opening an application called Product Finder, and signing in, and now it will search for the product. And now it will look for the best price and the best store by clicking in the price header. To sort this result. So here we have the best price is $510 and the best store is the famous store. So the bot will grab this result. It will clear the screen, close the application, and then it will send the callback to the system API with this data. Okay, so by now it should have sent the callback to the system API. So if we open the Anypoint Studio, here we have it in our logs, the product code, the best price, 510, best store, the famous store. So it worked. We were able to start the automation from the system API, and the automation ran and it sent the callback request, and we were able to get the results back in the system API. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was useful. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at MakeSense.